This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com. This is episode 364 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We've gotten a lot better at analyzing fantasy football through the years, like a lot better. If you go back and read the things that I was putting together when I first started writing and analyzing fantasy, it's legitimately not very good. I'm not ashamed of the content necessarily, but I've gotten better at analyzing, and the whole community has too. As we've gotten better, there's been a push to find really predictive metrics, to ignore the stuff that doesn't matter as much and focus on stuff that's only predictive. But I don't really agree with that. I don't disagree with the idea that finding predictive metrics is great, but football statistics that aren't predictive are still very helpful when analyzing fantasy football, because it helps us understand regression, and it helps us figure out what matters and what doesn't when our competition may not totally get it. I'm bringing this up because this week I got a lot of questions about regression. One was from @FFZinger that said, touchdown regression is the most commonly discussed, and rightfully so, regression in fantasy football. But are there any other types that you value? For example, Mike Williams' 20.4 yards per reception is bound to drop, as well as perhaps Hollywood Brown's 12.7 will rise. Now, I won't dig into yards per reception specifically here, but I want to dig into the idea of non-touchdown statistics regressing. You can think of this in a really basic way to get your mind going. If a player has a really high yards per reception rate, or if a player has a really high yards per target rate or a really high yards per carry rate, it's probably going to be pretty hard for that player to repeat that performance over and over and over again. But the thing is, a lot of casual fantasy managers, and I'd actually say like 80% or more of fantasy managers, they don't think of data this way. For example, we rarely see players rush for 5 yards per carry or more in consecutive seasons. But when Johnny from down the street saw Philip Lindsay's 5.4 yards per carry rate with 192 attempts during his rookie year, he might have said, wow, imagine how many yards Philip Lindsay would have if he had more carries. And Lindsay did see more carries during his sophomore season, but he still rushed for fewer yards. Because situations change and things regress. And maybe that big run one year didn't happen the next year. So if you see someone say yards per reception doesn't matter, I'd say that it does, since you're playing against other humans in fantasy football. And if other humans are going to overstate what a touchdown total might say, or what a yards per carry rate says, then you're at an advantage when you analyze not just the statistics that matter, but the ones that don't matter too. So I guess to answer this question from FF Zinger more directly, yes, there are a ton of statistics that I look at when analyzing regression, even though those statistics don't matter for predictiveness. Now, before getting to the rest of the questions today, I wanted to let you guys know about FanDuel's NBA simulations. Each night, FanDuel will offer a pool of players from a given night's scheduled NBA games. You'll be able to draft a full lineup using the standard roster limits and salary cap, just like you would for a normal NBA multi-game format. Players will be randomly assigned stats from a game they played during the season, and scores will be slowly revealed throughout the night. The contests are 100% free, but winners will be awarded site credit and potentially other prizes each night. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. This first question, or I guess next question on today's show says, hey JJ, I have a regression question for you. The PFF fantasy football projections for 2020 have Alvin Kamara projected for 11.1 touchdowns on the ground and 3.9 touchdowns through the air. I had a lot of Kamara last year, and his lack of touchdown production was very frustrating given his yardage totals. But watching his film, it appears that Taysom Hill's usage around the goal line really hurt Kamara last year. He didn't vulture a ton of touchdowns, but there were a lot more formations where it looks like Hill replaced Kamara. And if you aren't on the field near the goal line, you aren't going to score very many touchdowns. All offseason, Kamara is going to be the regression candidate poster boy. I appreciate the random chance of football and the importance of understanding regression, but if we don't dig deeper and look at why a guy like Kamara goes from 14 rushing touchdowns to 5, isn't that lazy analysis? As the best numbers-driven analyst in the business, thank you. How do you factor in the nuances of play calling and personnel or just red zone usage when you look at regression candidates? Sorry for the long question. Love the show, Nick. And then in a PS, he listed Kamara's red zone rushing in 2018 and then his red zone rushing in 2019, and at the bottom of it, it says, "I'm just saying." So there's a lot to tackle here. Let's start with the first part where PFF has Kamara with 15 total touchdowns. My projections have Kamara at about 13 touchdowns. So I'm a little bit lower, but I still think that your question would still stand, so let's just keep this going. Let's look at, did Taysom Hill actually hurt Alvin Kamara last year? I don't think the evidence shows that he did to the degree in which you might think that he did. The Saints ran the ball a lot less in the red zone and at the goal line last season than they did in 2018. So the statistics that you mentioned at the end of the email aren't really that relevant. And by the way, the statistics that he did mention were rankings for Alvin Kamara and red zone touches in 2018 and 2019. What we need to look at is the percentage of those types of touches that a player is seeing rather than the raw number and where that player ranked. Because in the end, goal line rushes come down to offensive efficiency and effectiveness, not the individual player's effectiveness. Players in bad offenses don't see as much red zone work because the offenses aren't in the red zone as much. In 2019, Kamara actually had 53% of New Orleans goal line touches. In 2018, that number was 40%. He did see a fewer percentage of red zone looks last year, but it was a drop by less than 8%, going from 46% to almost 39%. And keep in mind, he played fewer games in 2019 than he did in 2018. Meanwhile, Taysom Hill's numbers in the red zone and goal line on the ground actually dropped year over year. He didn't have a single goal line rush last year, and he saw fewer than 9% of the team's overall red zone attempts. In 2018, he saw 10% of New Orleans goal line rushes and almost 14% of the team's red zone attempts. Now, Kamara did go from seeing 3 targets at the goal line to none last year, whereas Taysom Hill went from 0 to 4. So they basically flip-flopped. But that's not going to explain the difference in touchdowns for Kamara one year to the next. Not even close. That might explain like 1 or 2 touchdowns. To me, there's more important evidence out there that points to Kamara's lack of touchdown production. Like I said, the Saints didn't produce even close to as many goal line plays and red zone plays last year. But they also saw their starting quarterback get hurt. And Kamara himself, as we know, he was also hurt throughout the season. If you look at how the Saints did in 2019 versus 2018 and 2017, there's a pretty clear difference. We saw a higher pass-to-rush attempt ratio last year in neutral game scripts, and a higher pass-to-rush ratio in general. That can explain a higher ratio of passing touchdowns to rushing touchdowns, which is what they had. Last year, the Saints threw 3 passing touchdowns for every 1 rushing touchdown. The previous 2 seasons saw that ratio at 1.27 and 1. That's a significant difference. Most importantly, the Saints just weren't as good offensively at scoring touchdowns. They scored a total of 48. The previous season saw them at 59. So basically what happened in 2017 is that the Saints had a very low pass-to-rush touchdown ratio. That helped skew touchdowns a little bit in the favor of their running backs. In 2018, they were able to maintain those touchdown totals because they scored a lot of touchdowns. So the ratio changed, but it didn't matter to the running back's bottom line because there were more touchdowns to go around. But in 2019, they likely threw for touchdowns at too high of a rate. They had the 4th highest pass-to-rush touchdown ratio in the league last year. That's likely to not remain the same. I know I just dumped a bunch of stats onto you guys, but this is why Kamara is very unlikely to come close to repeating his touchdown totals from last year, as long as he's healthy. Maybe 13 total touchdowns seems high if you think that Taysom Hill takes some, but based on what we've seen, that's likely to only be a touchdown or 2. Kamara should at least be projected for double-digit scores. This next question is another regression-related question from @IkeAzar. With touchdown regression coming and only having a 9% target share in games where both Jamal Williams and Devontae Adams played last year, is Aaron Jones a top 10 running back? My projections actually have Jones at RB10. So I don't think he's a lock to be a top 10 guy, no. Now for the record, the players ahead of him are Christian McCaffrey, Saquon, Kamara, Dalvin Cook, Zeke, Chubb, Jacobs, Fournette, and Derrick Henry. And there are arguments to be made for guys like Miles Sanders, Austin Eckler, Joe Mixon, or even Le'Veon Bell. I mean, the running back competition this year is actually pretty fierce. And 2 things to keep in mind with this. I don't draft based off of projections. They're really just there to help me guide conversation and learn more about a player's situation. The other thing, though, is that projections capture regression because it's showing what a player is projected to do in a given season. So with regression baked in, Jones is still pretty damn good. I think there are worries, but there are a lot of worries for pretty much any running back outside of CMC and maybe Saquon Barkley. So to me, he's top 10, but barely. And you can make arguments for him probably being overdrafted this year. Chris Carson or the 2020 104? This one's pretty easy for me. I'm taking the 104 all day. I don't think it's really that close. Carson's going to be 26 this year. He hasn't been able to stay healthy, and it's not like he's got this crazy profile to back him up. With the 104, you're guaranteed one of the best backs in this class or one of the two elite wide receivers. So to me, I'd take the 104 and not even second guess the decision. This next question is from @JLWoods9898. You see a bump up for Mike Williams with Tyrod or Tua at quarterback? Tyrod has an underrated deep ball, no? Maybe some positive regression in the touchdown department in store for Williams. I feel like he could be a buy low in dynasty/keeper right now, but would love your thoughts. Williams should have scored more touchdowns than he did last year, yes. But I think it's hard to make the argument that anyone in that Chargers offense is going to see a bump in 2020. Maybe longer term if the quarterback that they pick ends up being really good. But one of the pluses with Rivers was that the Chargers were actually pretty pass heavy in neutral game scripts when Rivers was under center. When games have been within 6 points, they've ranked in the top 5 in pass to rush ratio in 4 of the last 5 seasons. And Rivers isn't necessarily a conservative quarterback. He ranked 6th in deep ball rate last year, which I'm defining as passes that travel 15 or more air yards. He was 6th last year among 200 plus attempt passers. And he's generally been in the middle of the pack in recent history. And that's all while ranking really well in completion percentage on those throws. In fact, since 2011, his worst season in completion percentage on those throws, on those 15 plus air yard throws, is 39%. The average completion percentage on those throws over this time period is 41%. So his worst season in completion percentage since 2011 was actually pretty close to the average across the league. So with Tyrod, maybe he'll be able to keep up the frequency in throwing it deep. But the Chargers are likely not going to be as pass-heavy of a team with Tyrod Taylor under center if they can help it. Maybe a rookie comes in and surprises and is able to outperform expectations, but Mike Williams is not in the most desirable spot for 2020. This next question says, how do you factor in bad offensive play when it comes to incoming rookies, a la Cam Akers? Okay, so every player should be looked at individually to understand context fully. But what I don't understand is people trashing Cam Akers for his lack of production given the offense that he was in, when his market share numbers actually tell a pretty decent story. That's why market share is so important. Instead of comparing the raw production of Jonathan Taylor to Cam Akers, you're looking at the production compared to the rest of that player's offense. You're looking at how frequently he was used. Because if he's used a lot and he's constantly getting the ball, that signals that that player might be pretty good. Using final season numbers, Cam Akers has the 4th best rushing yard share in this class. Meaning if you look at a team's total rushing yards, Cam Akers' percentage of rushing yards for his team was 4th best in this class. The only players who were better were James Robinson, Eno Benjamin, and Keyshawn Vaughn. Jonathan Taylor was 5th. That's not an input in my model, but it gives his rushing total some context. One of the inputs in my model, though, is reception share, or the percentage of receptions that a player had in his offense. Cam Akers ranked in the top 10 in reception share. Now, I understand the offense might have been bad, but the offense was bad for everyone in that offense. That's why we're looking at market share numbers. And just to reiterate, I don't just look at these numbers and take them at face value. We should be investigating all of these guys and their situations. But the numbers are predictive. They can and they do help us make better decisions. That's especially true if we're modeling. This last question says, who's a running back currently going outside the top 20 that you could see being top 5? So according to Fantasy Pros rankings right now, Damian Williams is the RB22. And I think that he makes a lot of sense for this question. In regular season games over the last 2 years where he's seen 10 or more carries, or when he's been the most heavily utilized back in that backfield, Damian Williams has averaged 21.4 PPR points per game. You know how many running backs had a better points per game average than that last year? 1. His name was Christian McCaffrey. And that even continued into the playoffs. In the Chiefs' 5 playoff games over the last 2 years, Williams has scored at least 1 touchdown per game while averaging 16 carries and almost 7 targets per contest. What if the Chiefs in the draft decide to not spend at the running back position again this year? Damian Williams burned a lot of people last year. I totally get it. But he also wasn't totally healthy. When he's healthy and active, he's a legit option in that offense with a ton of upside. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Hope you're all staying safe, and I'll talk to you on Monday.